My name is Marie Cruz. I'm the Managing Director of Iberia Legal Group. This is the third edition of Agenda Africa. Not to delay this any further and to use the time to hear your views, what I would like is to introduce Alex Vines.
Thank you very much. My name's Alex Vines. I'm one of the directors here at Chatham House, so you're very welcome to the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Okay, my job is to moderate a panel on Angola and Mozambique. These are two countries I know intimately. Now, talking about Angola and Mozambique, they're both very different, as you will all know. There are some similarities. Both countries, in my view, are going through a process of working out presidential succession at the moment. It's still unclear who that may well be, but that has tremendous policy implications in terms of Angola's future trajectory and what will happen. But the politics is already there. We've already seen some of it. And the questions will be, who will succeed him? Will that have policy and commercial implications in Mozambique's trajectory? The other risks that I see in Mozambique are ones that are very predictable. Spikes in consumer price inflation, for example. There have been riots in Mozambique, as you know, in Maputo. These were actually, in some ways, the first riots were outriders to Arab Spring. Some of the patterns in Mozambique are not dissimilar to what we're seeing in North Africa. Large numbers of young people, many of them now from the peri-urban areas with certificates, feeling they have been educated through the proliferation of universities, who feel they have entitlement to jobs and opportunities. And although the growth rates in Mozambique are very impressive, they are not enough to absorb a pool of young people. Mozambique and Angola, one of the other things they have that are similar are significantly high levels of population growth. Angola is one of the quickest growing populations in the world, and the growth rates, even 7-8%, are not enough to absorb this. This is a challenge that both Frelimo and the MPLA are facing, and it will be increasingly a challenge of how investment creates jobs and opportunities. The positives are that both countries are at peace. They've both experienced extraordinary levels of economic growth, and they are very attractive investment destinations. Indeed, that's what this conference here is about today. And the following speakers will be talking about this. Let's move on to the first speaker, which is about new investors, where and why.
Thank you very much, Alex. My role today, in fact, is to draw back a little bit from focus on Angola and Mozambique, just to put both those countries within the African context, and also to sort of briefly and quickly run through where Africa is at present. So basically, as you probably all know, Africa's growth for the last decade has been around about 5% across the board. So when you put all these countries together, and then you end up with about 5 or 6% continuous growth, even during the time of economic slowdown, you know that something strange is happening. The current African GDP is roughly around $2 trillion. This is expected to increase to about 29 trillion by 2050, which would be roughly equivalent to the US and EU GDPs at the moment. Of course, the US and EU GDPs by 2050 will have also increased, but this will give us some idea of where Africa is headed. We have a consumer boom taking place right now. We have a very large middle class. About 300 million families are now classified by the African Development Bank as middle class. Now, the question is this growth sustainable? So the question is, where is the money? The growth at the moment is composed 30% only of commodities. 60% has come from services. There's huge construction projects all over Africa. So construction is a huge area. And then manufacturers. African consumers are buying everything in sight. And, why not? They're joining the rest of the world. And therefore, there's a huge demand for consumer goods, foodstuffs, packaged foods, etc., equipment, farm equipment, fertilizers, all these are in huge demand. And the other area, of course, which is where the big investment is and where the fiercest competition is at the moment, is in the natural extraction areas. And there are new discoveries being made offshore East Africa, offshore West Africa. So production of hydrocarbons is going to increase. But the biggest and most exciting area, again, Mozambique, is really gas. Now we are between 110 and 180 trillion cubic feet. Tanzania in the same area has got about 9 trillion cubic feet. If these two are put together, you're looking at probably the second biggest reserve of natural gas in the world after Qatar. It has also probably got the largest emerging coal reserves in the world. So Mozambique is sitting on a huge fortune. And that, to me, is where the direction of investment is heading at the moment. Trade, however, patterns are beginning to change. So the pattern of trade is swinging very much towards emerging economies and away from traditional economies, but again, not at a catastrophic pace as yet. Let me leave this at the moment as it is, and then we can discuss some other details. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anver. We'll move straight on to the next speaker, who is Steve Blundell. You're very welcome.
Thank you very much indeed, Anver, for that overarching view of the exciting growth that we see in Africa as a whole, and particularly in the two countries we're looking at today. What I was asked to address is the extent to which that is both creating opportunity and impacting indeed on legal businesses. It won't surprise anyone round the table to hear that actually the local firms themselves, of course, are benefiting massively from the kind of economic growth and activity that Anver has reflected upon. If you look at African countries that are growing at 8 or 9%, the professional services firms in those countries are growing at anything 3, 4, 5 times that pace of growth. On the other hand, those firms are not unaware that the pot of gold that Anver described, it's attracting in a huge amount of interest from the global law firms. What's really changed now is that those local firms have become really quite anxious about the probable impact on them of these global firms arriving on their doorstep, either literally or in some shape or form, and therefore attracting their very best people that they've been trying to develop. They worry that as these firms emerge on their doorstep, that the basis on which they've done business, their global standards, if you like, won't measure up. I think they worry most of all that as business becomes much more global, they will see more and more of the best work, the high-value work, just simply repatriated to London or to New York, and that they will be left with basically the very low-value and uninteresting end of work. And we spoke principally to partners who have responsibility either for those firms' African presence or in some cases, particularly with the American firms, where they don't have that level of coordination. We spoke to partners who have a big chunk of business in Africa, and therefore they spend a lot of time dealing with African business. And we asked them basically about the scale of the opportunity, we asked them about the pace of change that they see, and we asked them about the nature of their relationships with the local firms. Perhaps unsurprisingly, their interest is very closely correlated with the foreign direct investment patterns that Anver was talking about. But for the most part, actually the flow of legal work, of course, is still very closely related to the extractive industries, and I guess in the countries we're talking about today, that would be very much the case. What I found interesting in talking to the international firms was their differing views about how they want to build their presence in Africa as a continent. If you take one end of the scale, if you look at the Magic Circle firms, typically they've been doing business for a very long time in Africa, and they regard the countries themselves as actually worthwhile doing business with in their own right, if I can put it that way. Whereas actually for the firms that we might typify as international law firms, they have a strategy which is much more built around this idea of gateways. So they think that they can actually build an African presence by developing a strong gateway centre in one or a number of jurisdictions in Africa. all of the firms that I spoke to believe that they will have a pretty significant presence physically in one shape or form on the African continent in the next 5 or so years. And that brings me to the point about relationship development, because the firms that are further advanced in their own business here have invested a phenomenal amount of effort in getting to know the firms that are actually local firms in Africa. My conclusion, I guess, is that there is an atmosphere at the moment of suspicion on the part of those local firms towards the potential colonialism, I guess, of the global law firms. But I think on the part of the global law firms, there's a great deal of willingness actually to partner and to do business in a much more open way. Thank you very much.
Steve, I wanted to kind of push you a bit on gateways. Do you see these at all useful? You know, some people are talking about gateways being Portugal or Spain, for example, and indeed you've got a number of law firms based out of Lisbon here. Does this work?
Yes, this issue of gateways is an interesting one. I suppose to some extent it's a function of the resources and level of investment that the firms in question are prepared to make. If you look at the very major Magic Circle firms, for example, the sheer scale of the resources that they have means that they can actually work much more on a country-by-country basis. And the judgment call then is really the economic triggers you would expect about whether that country itself is sufficiently appealing and attractive for that level of investment. If you happen to be a firm that doesn't have those depth of resources, or the firm isn't prepared to commit those resources to the continent, and so those firms may say, well, we need to prioritise a number of gateway countries. The logic of it sounds great said like that. Those who've worked in Africa know that the actual logistics of that, making it happen, can be a far cry from that nice little piece of theory.